All right, today we're back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. We are getting really close to the home stretch on this thing. We got a few more projects to go, but it's really taking shape. Super exciting. It's all coming together. So what we were gonna do is dive back into our turbo kit. We had to put it on hold. We were waiting on a couple parts to finalize the hot side before we could finalize the downpipe, before we could finalize the cold side. It's a bit of a domino effect with projects like this, and you kind of got to do one thing before the other, and a lot of stuff is going to depend around how this turbo kit finishes out, where everything goes, how it all fits in there. So this is priority number one. Once we get this done, it is hammer down for the home stretch. It's mostly wiring and plumbing. So that being said, I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering and let's get into it. All right, before we get too deep into today's video, I wanted to talk to you about today's video sponsor, Policy Genius. So when I got the new truck to replace the Fummins as my tow rig, I knew it was probably a good time to compare my insurance rates. Since I'm bundling my home and auto insurance, there's a lot of money to be saved, and I haven't checked on it and compared rates in longer than I'd like to admit. And knowing that the truck was gonna be a little pricey to insure compared to what I was used to, I figured it was a good time to have a look, and that's really where Policy Genius came in. So Policy Genius is a one-stop shop to find and buy the insurance you need, and getting started is easy. You just go to policygenius.com/Taylor Ray with 2 R's, answer a few quick questions about yourself and your property, and Policy Genius will show you price estimates of policies that fit your needs and help you find the best option. And not only that, but the team of experts will look into options to save you even more money, especially when you're bundling home and auto insurance. And that team doesn't work for the insurance companies, they work for you. If they find you a better rate than what you're paying now, they'll switch you over for free. Easy as that. With all of that, Policy Genius has saved customers an average of $1,250 per year over what they were paying on their home and auto insurance. And the best part for me is that they do not sell your information to third parties, which, as most of you probably know by now, that is really hard to find in today's day and age. So if you're interested in trying it out, head to policygenius.com/Taylor Ray with 2 R's to get your free home and auto insurance quotes and just see how much you could really save. So that being said, we need to get back to work. Let's get to it. All right, got the welder out here. We are about to commit to welding this merge. Now, our flex joints did finally show up. So we have our flex joints, these shorter ones that we got. This is what the holdup was. We were waiting to get the flex joints before we finalized all this. But we've had a bit of a change of heart on running the flex joints at all. So the idea here is, if this stuff all doesn't fit perfect, you have some misalignment, some flex to get everything lined up. Whereas without this, this all has to be perfect. And things move when you weld them. So if it moves at all, best case, we get it on there and it's tensioned and not ideal. Worst case, it doesn't go on at all. So that's the idea of the flex joint, and to allow everything to heat and contract and move around. Now we are gonna be solid mounting the turbo to the chassis. So none of this stuff should move. This is all going to be mounted together in one big happy family. But the downfall of the flex joints is these are a lot more prone to fail than a piece of tubing, right? Like these flex joints fail. I've had them fail on my LS Miata, and that's an NA application, So these are going to be under back pressure from the boost. So these are basically going to be pressurized because that pressure is going to build up going into the turbo. So it's tough because it'd be way easier to put those in before we weld into the merge. So that way, if things move around a little bit, we can still get it in fine. It'll just make that easier. But we don't know if this is gonna work or not unless we weld it into the merge. So point is, what we're gonna do, what we decided on is I'm gonna go ahead and weld it into the merge. And if everything fits back good, we're gonna leave it. And if we have any issues down the road, we can add the flex joints. But it's a lot harder to remove the flex joints than to add them. So that's why we're just gonna try it. So what we're gonna do to try to minimize all this stuff moving around is weld as much of this into the merge as we can in the car here. Now the tricky part is we can't remove this intercooler pipe because it's holding up the turbo here. But I think I can get a decent bit of the way around and just try to weld as much as we can with it all attached and fixed so it doesn't move too much. That's the plan. Let's give it a shot, see what happens. So we started working on supporting the turbo from some other spots of the bay so we can pull this intercooler pipe out and have a much better, cleaner, straighter access at the merge itself. We also needed to tinfoil up all the flanges because even though we're welding this on the car, we still need to back purge it. This is one of the most important welds we have that needs to be back purged. So that was a really important thing to try to figure out and get done. And obviously the more we can close everything off and seal everything up, the less argon we're going to use, which you go through a lot of argon welding this kind of stuff. So we got it all sorted out. We got the intercooler pipe out. We got the turbo exactly where we wanted it. Went ahead and started tacking and tacking and tacking. It's really important to get a lot of tacks on something like this. We don't want it to move. So we wanted to make sure while we're welding here, we're not making it pull over there. So we got our tacks on. We started welding, and it's tricky. In out of position welding like this is really what separates the men from the boys. You know, you see some welders that can just hammer out beautiful welds in some weird, crazy position like this. It's tricky where you're leaning way over. You can see this side came out all right. That side, not so much. Not so much. Welding in the car is, man, it's tricky. It's tough. So we got that much welded. We're going to call it, but I was like, you know what, let me see if I can get in here underneath and weld the bottom side. And it's one of those things, man, it's tough because you're working the pedal with your leg, and you also, when you get in there without a helmet on, it's like, oh yeah, I can definitely get in here and weld. But then you get in there with the helmet and it takes up so much more space that you realize you don't actually fit in there. But either way, we got the majority of it welded. We did test it before we pulled it off and welded the rest of it to see if it was still fitting, see if it had warped any, see if it had pulled any, and luckily it hadn't. So it was really all on this last bit of weld, if we could keep it from warping just this last little bit. And it is cool to see this piece off the car because it looks pretty small and compact and efficient on the car, but when you see it off the car, you realize there's really not much to this hot side, which the whole goal of this build is simplicity, serviceability, and reliability. So anyway, we got that thing welded up. We went ahead and put it back on. Now it was a tiny, tiny, tiny bit off because these V-bands, they have no misalignment, so any bit of movement through the welding is going to be enough to make it off. But it was just where it needed to be to get it all back on and everything lined back up, and was happy. We went ahead and started taking the zip ties that we had holding the turbo up off. That's the nice thing about these big zip ties. You can get in there to the latch and take them off, and they're pretty much reusable. So with those off, we pulled the jack out, and it's official. The turbo is supported on its own, under its own weight. There's no jack, no zip ties, no nothing. It's in there, it's mounted, it's fixed in its location. The hot side is done. All right, mission successful. Got the turbo hanging here on the weight of the exhaust. It didn't flex at all when we took the jack out. Now we are absolutely 1000% still gonna brace this thing. This turbo is probably almost 50 pounds. So it'd be a matter of time letting it hang on the exhaust like this. So we're gonna brace it probably down to the subframe, don't worry. But we wanted to see if it would hold itself, and there is no movement. So I'm happy with it. We're gonna leave it. If we have issues or, we heat cycle it and we can't get it back on, chop, flex joint, but we're gonna give it a shot as is for now, see how it goes. Because it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's like maybe without a flex joint we crack stuff, but with a flex joint, we might blow the flex joint out. That's it though. That's it with the turbo actually just hanging there. No jack under it. Wild. The turbo's been sitting on a jack for like 2 weeks. You can see, nice and high up, well above the ground. We got plenty of ground clearance still. Really, the intercooler is the lowest thing. The car's on its own weight, and it's still a long ways up. And the car is not raised, like with the fenders on. It's dang near tuck and tire. So that's pretty much an accurate example of how it's gonna sit. That's so exciting, I'm pumped. All right, well, we put the jack back in here. Start working on, now that the turbo is fixed in its location, is the downpipe. So we know for sure we're gonna start off with a 90. So we can get our start here by tacking this in and then start mocking up from there. So we're not trying to hold two pieces at a time. So we're gonna yank this V-band off, tack this Johnny in. It's a tight radius, 4-inch, and see what we can come up with from there. All right, downpipe finished. So we started mocking up from our 90, and it was definitely going to be tricky. This is going to be the hardest part of the downpipe, snaking it through here. And we quickly realized we weren't going to be able to mock this whole thing up and then pull it out and tack it and weld it. It's too tight of an area to get in there with your hands and hold one side and the other, so we were gonna have to just tack this as we went. So we got the first 45 tacked on, and then I wanted to go ahead and lift the car up, get it up on the quick jacks again, and pull the front end off, because the front end's not going to interfere with anything as far as the downpipe's concerned. It's all behind that area. So pulling this off is gonna give us a lot better access to get in here and get to the things we need to get to, and it's going to be a tall order in general to mock this up, so we need all the help we can get. So we also decided to go ahead and pull the driver's side header off. That way we could get down in there and tape and check. Now, obviously, it'd be great to leave it on, but one of those things. You got to do what you got to do sometimes. All right, we got this thing back on the quick jacks. So I did go ahead and pull this header off. I debated it a lot. I would prefer to have it in place, have everything clamped together as we build this, because the tolerances are going to get really tight going through here. So I wanted everything to be in place, but we've got it locked in with this V-band. We got the weight supported by the jack. It didn't move any when we disconnected the V-band, and this gives us way more room to get in here. So it's a compromise. Anyway, jibber jabber, this is what we got so far. We got our tire radius 90 to a 45. My idea here is we're gonna build back to somewhere in this range, put a V-band there, so that way the downpipe's not too long. Hopefully we can get it in and out. That's a big thing. So we'll have to kind of test that as we go, because we can't pull it out here. It has to go out the front, or potentially in this way and down there. So that's something we really have to consider when we do this and check it all the way through. But V-banded ideally just past the subframe, so that way it's disconnectable from under the car, and then run it to just past the transmission, have a V-band there, V-band it there, so that way if we ever need to drop the trans, it's just two V-bands, bada bing, bada boom, exhaust drops out, transmission's free and clear to come out. So that'll be really nice. Like, when you have long tubes, trying to get a trans out is difficult, because usually they come back kind of past the bell housing. It's a real struggle in the Miata. So to be able to just pull one exhaust pipe out with two V-bands and have all the room to drop the transmission, that'll be really nice. So anyway, that's the plan. But we got to execute. It's time to start cutting into our fresh, nice straight sections and see what we can come up with here. So we did some measuring and figured out we needed about a 4-inch straight section before our next bend. So we went ahead and cut our first piece out of this nice, fresh, 5-foot long piece of 4-inch straight section. Now, it was a little tricky to get it clamped in the saw. When you have long pieces like this, you really need to support them on the other end, but if you support them with something too tall, then it's gonna angle it one way. If it's too short, it's gonna angle it the other way, so finding the right piece, kind of tricky. But we got it cut. We got it cleaned up on the old belt grinder as per usual. The cleanup makes the biggest difference in stuff like this. So we started snaking our pieces in. This is why this is so tricky. Because you can't really get to the pieces because it's such a tight fit down there. So after looking at it, after eyeballing it, I realized we're gonna need a few more pieces down the line to make sure that where we have this bend angled is gonna work and it's gonna send us past the engine mount. So we went ahead and used the trusty dusty PET tape. This stuff works really well because you can tape these pieces in place, and you don't wanna trust it for too many pieces, but to get a couple in place, it works, and you can see if it's gonna work, and if it does work, you can leave it exactly how it is, pull it out of the car, and tack it. So we move the downpipe around a little bit. We start mocking up our next couple bends and figuring out how that's all gonna work. Once we're good with it, we went ahead and pulled the downpipe out, and we're just tacking along the way. So we're tacking these two pieces on before we start building from here, because it gets a little hairy real quick, especially with the tape. You start taping a few more pieces on, and then all of a sudden the whole thing falls apart, and you basically got to start from scratch. So with those tacked up, went ahead and threw the downpipe back in, or the start of the downpipe, the half of the downpipe, and then it was time to come up with our next two pieces, get those in place, and tack those on. So like I said, the trickiest part is getting 4-inch just between the steering shaft and the head, just to get it down into place to mock it up, is a tight squeeze. But after looking at it, we figured out with this scrap straight section about how long we wanted our next straight piece to be. We went ahead and cut it out yet again, cleaned it up on the belt grinder, so on and so forth, and then started mocking these two pieces up. So this part is where things get critical, because not only are we going around the engine mount, but we're setting ourselves up to go through the next hardest spot, which is going to be between the bell housing and the frame rail of the car. 4-inch just fits there, and we need to make sure that we have a good run from here to get us through there with ease, with minimal bends and jogging back and forth. So we get it where we were happy with it, but it wasn't quite right. I realized if we went a little bit longer on the straight section and pushed the 45 out all the way to the frame rail, it would make it a lot easier to get us lined up to head down and next to the bell housing. You've really got to think 3 or 4 steps ahead with this kind of stuff. So you can see the piece is just a little bit longer. It was like 1.25 inches longer, but I mean, that 1/4 of an inch can make the difference between something fitting right and not fitting well at all. So we get these pieces back in, and we're at the point now where we can't really tape them to the start of the downpipe. So we need to put a couple witness marks, get them where we want, and pull everything back out of the car and tack it on the bench. Now this is a little risky because if it's rotated at 1/16 of an inch, it might not fit right, but with something like this in this tight of an area, you don't really have a choice. Now this is where I ran into a bit of a moral dilemma. I wanted to be lazy and go ahead and just tack this 45 on the straight before I tack the straight onto the downpipe. It would have been way easier to do it this way. But I know that this is going to be tight getting this downpipe in and out. So then I decided, no, I'll just tack the straight, and if it fits with the 45, then I'll tack the 45. And then I decided, no, it's not worth the risk, because if it doesn't fit, I'll have to cut the tack. So we're going to tack just the straight section on, leave the 45 tape, check it back in. If it fits, great, we'll tack the 45 on. And what do you know? It didn't fit. It didn't fit. This is a tight area to get it through, and it just, that little bit more, that extra bend wasn't enough. We took it off, and now it fits. So we know now that we need to terminate this here. This is where we're going to have to put our V-band, which is not ideal. This is not where I wanted to put the V-band. I was hoping to make this whole thing a little longer than this, but you got to do what you got to do. You've got to end it where you can get it in and out, right? It's got to be serviceable. So since we're putting the V-band, we now have to cut a little bit off the straight section, because that V-band is going to take up that space. And with the length of that straight, it's putting that 45 right at the frame rail. So we basically cut off the thickness of the V-band, went ahead and welded the V-band clamp onto the end of the downpipe, and then test fitted everything back in. And man, it was tight and it was a struggle. We had to do some modifications, but we got it done. We got it in. All right, well, here is our first section, our downpipe. I really wanted to make it longer. I almost tacked this 45 on there before checking, but I was like, you know what? This is gonna be real tight to get this through here. Let me check it first. I'm glad I did, because it would not have fit. No chance. We almost weren't able to even fit this with the V-band. I had to trim a tiny bit off the motor mount just to get the V-band to slip past it. Tried putting it in both ways. That's the tough thing about a V-band. It adds a lot of thickness. You know, now you've got a 4.5 inch pipe essentially that you're sliding through. So luckily we were able to make it work, because I thought about going to a slip joint, but the problem with the slip joint is we got to slide it in, and this ends up, which luckily we got this distance right. We got this just perfect. We need it shoved all the way against the frame rail, because we got to shoot for down through that gap next to the bell housing. So that's going to be our next tight tolerance. I'm trying to minimize the bends and the welds in this and just make it a nice, smooth, straight shot. So luckily we were able to make this work. So what we're going to do now, what I want to do now, is go ahead, pull that flange off, tack this in, put it back in, make sure that's all good and happy, pull this whole assembly out, and go ahead and just weld up what we have, because just like this, it's going to move some when we weld it. So I like to weld section by section. That way when we start on the next section, it's already moved and grooved and done all the things it needs to do, and it should be, in theory, in its final resting spot. But first things first, let's get this tacked on so we can get this welded out. They had just enough room to get this V-band. Obviously I wanted to put it back to where it was behind the subframe, but we can at least get to it with an electric ratchet. So that's good. One of the things about V-bands is usually the pipe slides into them. So sometimes if you need that little bit extra, you can cheat it a little bit, you know, that way or that way. But this is pretty much what we need as is, so we don't need to worry about that. All right, let's check this thing back in there, and we'll pull the rest of it out, weld it out. After checking the second half of the V-band and making sure that 45 was going to work and everything was going to fit, we went ahead and pulled the downpipe out and started welding it out. We got our back purge set up on and just started going to town welding 4-inch takes a little while to weld because you're welding around a 4-inch diameter, which is a little over 12 inches, almost 13 inches of weld on each one. So, that adds up to multiple feet. But luckily, these being pre-cut bends and joints, aside from the straight section, man, these all fit together so good. And the better the fit up, the better the weld. You could be the best welder in the world and weld some stuff with some terrible fit up, and some amateur like me can go weld something with good fit up and it would almost probably look better, just because the fit up is such a huge part of the end product. So we got all the joints welded up. I like to wait and weld the V-bands separate. So once we got that done, we went ahead and clamped the second half in, put our back purge plugs in, and started welding out the V-band. Now, the reason for clamping the second half in is to prevent the V-band from warping. If you just go send it and weld one side, it is very likely that it's going to warp. So the second half acts as a heat sink and kind of holds it straight as you're welding it, and it's wanting to twist and pull and bend. And man, you don't realize how much stuff moves when you weld it until you try to not worry about it, and then your stuff doesn't fit anymore. So same thing with the flange for the downpipe out of the turbo. We went ahead and pulled the turbine housing off, clamped it to that, which is a great heat sink because it's so big, and welded it out that way, and even supported the other end so the weight of it wasn't trying to tug on it while we're welding it. We're doing everything we can to make sure this doesn't move and that these clamps and V-bands don't warp and leak and cause us all sorts of grief. So with all those welded up, they welded out really good. This one had a little bit of an extra ridge on it, so it's kind of nice to weld, kind of weird to weld, but really happy with how these came out. Butt joints are always kind of tricky because you're trying to draw a straight line, whereas with the V-band, you have a corner that you're welding into, and it kind of naturally wants to fill that void. So V-bands are always much easier to weld, but I was really happy with how this turned out. It looks so nice, so clean. It's solid unit. All right, let's see if it all goes back together. We made sure the V-bands didn't warp. Neither of them warped. They warp, they leak, no bueno, especially not this. Past this, not as big of a deal, but the O2 sensor is going to be in here. We can't have any leaks. So we started tossing the downpipe back in. I always like to kind of get an idea of what this would be like to do to the car after it's complete, after the fact, with other stuff in the way. How hard is it to get to this, to get to that? Just see if there's anywhere we can improve to make the serviceability a little better. But luckily, it went in pretty good. It's real tight past the engine mount, but it fits, it goes in, especially once you get used to it. And man, I gotta say, what a snazzy unit. Doing it like this with these pre-cut pieces was A1, the way to go. All right, downpipe's back in. Really pleased with how that turned out. The welds are all nice. The polished material looks so good. The fitment, the fit up, I mean, it's tight to snake 4-inch through anything. It was tight snaking it down through the truck. It's a full-size truck. So, I mean, I'm pretty happy with how much room we do have. But we got it going. Boom, V-band. And we've got our next section ready to start. So, pretty happy with how that's going. But it looks good, man. It looks really good. I'm really pumped on that. So, one thing, before we dive back into that, I do kind of want to toss the header back on and just get a look at everything with the header in and make sure that everything still fits and that, we kind of reset that the turbo is exactly where it's supposed to be. But before we do that, we got our new scavenge filters. You saw the last episode, we had some inline ones and they weren't going to work to come off the dry sump tank. It was an elaborate contraption to fit them. So we got these 90 ones, and it looks like they're going to work. So I'm going to try them out, and we got another pop-off regulator. So I stole the one I had on this car for the Miata to change its setup up. So basically what we have, since the dry sump creates so much vacuum, we shouldn't have any positive crankcase pressure, but in case we do, at 2 PSI, this will open and just vent the pressure, but there shouldn't be much coming out, so we just have a filter. On the other side, we have a vacuum regulator. So that is going to open if there's too much vacuum, because that dry sump can create so much vacuum it'll start to pull the seals in. So we basically got a regulator on either end. Too much vacuum, open. Too much positive pressure, open. This guy. So I want to get this back in. It's real tight in there. So many caps. Caps on caps on caps on caps. So we'll run them that way and then loop down to keep them as far away from the header as possible. But that should actually work out beautifully. Much nicer. Much better. Way happier. So with those on, we can move to putting the header in. I had to get those on and see how they fit. They came in, you know, it's one of those things. Sometimes you gotta just take a break from what you're doing and throw some new parts on. So this is another situation where we're kind of looking at the serviceability of this and how everything lines back up. And luckily, the way we built this header, it's really, really easy to get on and off. The other side's a good bit trickier, but this side kind of makes up for it being a total piece of cake. It takes like 5 minutes start to finish to put this whole header on, which really not bad. All right, well, this header went back in well, everything bolted back up, everything fit back together, which is great. The downpipe still got clearance everywhere, clearance. It did move. I really wanted to check that out and, you know, get a look at it with the header on. Oh, so fun. I love this stuff. So now we're gonna put the throttle body on. It's killing me having this tape on here. Been driving me nuts. Plus, obviously, we're gonna need it there to figure out what we need to do to our intake pipe. So we have this Motion Raceworks Icon throttle body. We went ahead and welded the screws in. I've seen some people with any different kind of throttle body have them back out. And this is a motor that I really don't want to risk it eating a bolt. So went ahead and welded them in. There's no reason we should be ever taking this plate off. It's not something I've worried about with other motors, but they're all junkyard stock bottom end stuff. So this one, we're taking the extra precaution. So this is the Motion Icon throttle body system. When they came out with this, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So they have a bunch of interchangeable ends that bolt on. So instead of this just coming with a 4-inch hose barb and then us having to change it or having to use some silicone coupler that necks down to our 3.5-inch, we can get all different types of front plates for this. So we have the 3.5-inch quick seal clamp. So this is like a Wanchang clamp. It's got a bunch of misalignment. So our intercooler pipe's just gonna weld right in there. We're gonna have to do some modifications to this. That is yet to be seen, but we get rid of that ugly silicone deal and have a much nicer, better sealing system. And the cool thing is if we ever change our setup, if we went twin turbo or NA or whatever, they make a bunch of different ends and we can keep the same base throttle body, which they build it with this super slim profile, and just swap the end. And the other nice thing is with all this together, it's a very compact package as opposed to having the barb going out, then welding the other side of one of these clamps on, then having the clamp, you know, your stack height would be up here. So anyway, really cool system they came up with. I've wanted one for a while and this is a perfect excuse to get one. So anyway, let's put these on and see what this thing looks like on there. Look at that, dude. That is a snazzy combination right there, let me tell you. Whew. I still need to get a TPS and IO air control valve. I didn't even think about that. Dang, son. Whew. Man, just putting all these fancy parts on it's getting me hyped, let me tell you. With the throttle body on, we wanted to go ahead and put the bash bar and intercooler back on so we could see just how close or how far the current intercooler pipe that came with the car was going to be, to see if we could not modify it, lengthen it, shorten it. We didn't really know. We wouldn't know until we got this in. We had no idea how all this was going to fit up. So with all that done, we wanted to drop this thing back on the ground and see how all this looked together. Alright, just wanted to look at it on the ground again. See the downpipe and everything from up here. Wow, that looks good. It's less obnoxious than I thought it would be. I hated the idea of having to run another piece of exhaust tubing, you know, because like if it was just this stuff, it would be so clean and simple, but then you got to run a 4-inch. But it really doesn't look bad. Like you almost don't even notice it from up here. Makes that curve. Whew. Man, this thing is coming together. Get to see it with the throttle body. It's so close. Yeah, it just needs a little more. But I've got material to redo this, so we'll chop it. It's gonna be tough because they welded this right next to this weld. But that's what it looks like on the ground. All right, so another thing I forgot about was we were curious to see if with these we could fit the breather tank here, which would be a very ideal scenario. Oh, and it'll work with just like a strap spacer. Sweet. All right, another thing figured out off the checklist. We're not sure if that was gonna work. We tried to put that thing just about everywhere else in this engine bay. I know there's only so many places to put stuff. So that's sorted out. We'll just have to make something. I guess we could whip something up real quick. We might have just enough flat bar left to do it. Let's try to do that. I'm conflicted. Do I want to end the day with this, or do I want to end the day with that? Which one, Josue? What do you think? I feel like this is definitely more of a project, so I don't want to rush it. Whereas that's a simple little... So for our day-ending project, we wanted to get one more thing done and dusted, knocked off the checklist, just trying to do as much as we can every day. Our decision was to do the breather tank mount. Seemed like it would be pretty simple, just a piece of flat bar with a couple bends in it to space it off. So we went ahead and marked out our cut line and our bend lines. We're gonna have a bend each direction on each end. So it's a little tricky. It's gotta be pretty precise to get everything to work and get everything bent, but we go ahead and cut it out on the bandsaw. Before we run it over to the belt grinder, I wanted to write down a note for myself. I have a little list here of material I need next time we go buy some material, so that way I don't forget. A lot of times I'm scratching my head, drawing a blank, trying to figure out what it was that I wanted when I last thought about, oh, what do I need? What do I need to get? And then I miss stuff, and then you forget. It's like a shopping list, except for metal and aluminum. But anyway, we get the belt switched over to an aluminum belt. You want to use separate belts just so you don't impregnate the metal from one type of metal to another, especially if you're going to weld it. So I just like to round the corners off, clean up the edges, just give it that little bit better fit and finish, and then it's time to bend it. So it's a little tricky. Like I said, it's a complex combination of bends. They're really close together, so they can only be so close together, but we get it done. We get our bend back. We get it to do what we need it to do, which is to space this thing off the firewall. So we take it back over, check it against the breather tank. It's a little bigger than it needed to be. Just the way I measured it out, it was just a little bigger. I kind of messed that part up, but it was good enough. It was going to work, so it was time to mount it into our plate. So luckily, we've got just enough room to mount it to this metal plate that we have sealing off our firewall. So we drill our holes, put our rib nuts in. It was kind of a tight squeeze for both of them, so we had to use the automatic rib nut tool with the right angle drill, which honestly worked out pretty well, better than I thought. So with that bolted up, we figured out where the breather tank needed to be, marked the holes for it, take it back off, drill out the holes for the breather tank. I always like to double check stuff before I put rib nuts in. I can move a hole, can't really move a rib nut. So we get those drilled out, get everything cleaned up, put our rib nuts in. It's kind of tough going through this thick of aluminum, but they work, they hold. Bolted into the firewall. We got to pull this one dry sump line out, which is kind of annoying and not ideal, not the most serviceable, but we get the tank in, done and dusted, or so we thought. All right, well, dry sump breather tank is mounted. Fits really good there, but it's one of those things, man. Stepping back and seeing it with it actually mounted there, I don't know that I can leave it, because if it overflows, it's going to overflow directly onto the header. If that happens in the middle of a run while we're full tilt boogie, it's probably going to catch fire. So I'm not going to be able to talk myself into leaving it there. I know it's silly. I should have thought about that before, but in my head it was further away. But I mean, it's literally just right over the header. Just one of those things. When you get a little perspective, when you step back, you're like, ooh. I mean, it sucks because we already drilled the holes and put the rib nuts in, but hey, it is what it is. It's part of it. You know, we're trying to do this the best we can. If we were in a rush, you know, it's something we might have to leave, and that would suck. But I'm just not willing to do that, you know? I put so much time into this car already, I'm not willing to rush it on the last lap. I was gonna say the 20-yard line, but I don't watch football. So at the last lap, we probably got about 10 laps to go. Anyway, we're gonna look at some other ideas, but that's changing. That being said, we are out of time. We're out of daylight. Not that it matters, we're in here, but we're out of time. I'm gonna go ahead and end it here. Thank you guys for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I will see you next time. Goodbye. All right, just kidding. We found a mount for it. Wow, perfect. Perfect. It's behind the tire. If it leaks, yeah, it's gonna leak on the car, but you're gonna leak stuff anywhere. It is downhill, but it was downhill there. I'm happy with that. And like Josue just mentioned, we can easily peek in there and see if it's leaking. And, even better, draining it. It's right next to the oil drain. So we can drain it with the drain plug. Wow. It literally took us, 5 minutes maybe, max, to do this. I just drilled and tapped holes in the plate. Spent all that time on that, and for nothing. But sometimes you build stuff and you have to just throw it away. It sucks because you don't want to throw it away. You just built it. I mean, that's one thing. That bracket took me like 10 minutes, but you know, it just is what it is sometimes. Like, you put a lot of time into something, you realize it's not going to work. You have to be able to give up on it and try to make it better. So anyway, okay, goodbye for real this time.